Imagine standing in the middle of a bustling city street, cars honking, neon lights glowing, conversations echoing from cafes. Life feels unstoppable, vibrant. Now freeze that moment. In the sky above, a single warhead detonates. In less than a second, the sound of laughter, the hum of engines, the chatter of millions, all silenced. Buildings once towering over you disintegrate as if made of paper. A flash brighter than the sun blinds you before you even have time to think. The air tastes of iron and ash. In a handful of heartbeats, a single moment of everyday life is transformed into an unthinkable absence. This isn't science fiction. It isn't some apocalyptic movie scene. This is the reality of modern nuclear weapons, the most destructive tools humans have ever built. And here's the chilling truth. What was unleashed in 1945 over Hiroshima and Nagasaki was only the beginning. Those bombs, devastating as they were, now look like firecrackers compared to the nuclear giants developed in the decades since. The question we're here to answer is simple, but terrifying. What is the true scale of modern nuclear weapons? The story begins with an invention that changed everything. A handful of scientists, hurried and secretive, bent over experiments and equations in the middle of the 20th century, discovered how to release a type of energy that until then had been confined to the stars. What began as an effort to end a war became the seed of a new era. When the first weapons were used over cities, the whole world learned, in the most terrible way possible, what those equations could do. The images from those days are etched into our collective memory. Flattened streets, twisted metal, the burned outlines of human shapes where people had been caught in the flash. Those first detonations were terrible and final in their own way, but they were also the opening act. In the decades that followed, technology did not stand still. The basic idea, release an enormous amount of energy in a single moment, was refined, reshaped, and multiplied. Scientists learned to trigger not just one kind of reaction, but two in sequence, and the energy involved grew by orders of magnitude. Bigger was an option, so too were smaller and more precise. Designers began to think not in terms of raw explosive power alone, but how a weapon could be delivered, how it could be targeted, and how its effects might be tailored to a particular purpose: to dissuade, to punish, to destroy, or to hold an enemy's forces at risk.
The world's collective relationship with these weapons was reframed by doctrine as much as by technology. The logic of deterrence took hold. The idea that to prevent war, one must be prepared to inflict unacceptable damage on a potential aggressor. Strategies arose whose internal logic was cold and exacting. The presence of retaliation, the certainty that an attack would be avenged, became the mechanism that was meant to hold the peace. It is a fragile equilibrium because it depends on two minds being perfectly rational in moments of extreme stress, and because it relies on systems of command, communication, and judgment that are vulnerable to human error. Today, the devices that fill arsenals around the world are not all the same. They vary in size, in shape, and in purpose. Some are designed to be enormous and terrifying, gestures of raw, unmistakable power. Others are made to be precise and small, intended to take out a specific military target, or to introduce a new, uncertain threshold on the battlefield. The destructive force of any one weapon depends on where it detonates relative to the ground, the size of the explosive yield, and the environment that surrounds it. An airburst will maximize blast and thermal effects over a wide area while minimizing local fallout, but a ground burst will pulverize soil and structures and create a dangerous and lingering radioactivity that can poison land and water for years. To understand how the effects of a single detonation translate into human consequences, we must think in terms of layered physical processes. The initial flash is a release of light and heat that can cause immediate severe burns far from the point of detonation. The expanding fireball creates a pressure wave that rips through buildings and hurls debris in lethal torrents. Prompt ionizing radiation, neutrons and gamma rays, bathes anyone nearby in a dose that can kill within hours or weeks. If the blast lifts dirt and debris into the cloud, those particles become radioactive and fall back over a wide area, contaminating homes, farmland, and water. Firestorms can arise when many fires combine into a single roaring inferno that sucks oxygen from the ground and produces winds that would be destructive even without the initial blast. It helps to think in human terms. Imagine a neighborhood where the corner grocery, the small clinic, and a school all sit within a few blocks of each other. A single detonation in the heart of that neighborhood would not only demolish buildings, it would erase the infrastructure that neighbors count on in the hours and days after a disaster. Medical care would be overwhelmed or destroyed. Clean water would become scarce. Refrigeration for medicines would fail, and communications would be broken just when they matter most. Relief convoys might be unable to cross bridges or roads. Survivors, if they can move, would soon encounter hunger and disease as supply chains collapse. The first minutes are brutal and visible. The following weeks and months are slow, merciless, and quieter, but they multiply the death toll far beyond the initial blast. The architecture of delivery, the ways in which these devices can be brought to a target, shapes the strategy and the danger. Weapons can sit in underground silos ready to be launched on a moment's notice. They can ride beneath waves aboard submarines that can hide and move, carrying with them the guarantee of retaliation. They can be lofted by aircraft or sent across continents on ballistic missiles that traverse the sky in stages, re-entering the atmosphere at incredible speeds. They can also be placed on shorter-range systems to threaten or coerce in regional conflicts. Each method of delivery has distinctive implications for warning time, for the ability to intercept, and for the psychology of decision-making under stress. And then there is the human element. Political leaders, military planners, and technologists make choices. The doctrines they embrace shape whether weapons are held in reserve or kept at high alert. The posture of forces, how quickly and under what circumstances they can launch, determines the room for deliberation, for second thoughts, for preventing mistakes. Ask any historian of crises, it is rarely the planned scenario that produces disaster. It is the ragged series of misperceptions, technical failures, and rushed judgments that compound into catastrophe. The frightening thing is that even limited use, by which some mean a small number of weapons targeted at military facilities or isolated regions, can have consequences that reach far beyond the immediate damage. Radioactive material does not keep national boundaries, and the climatic effects of burning cities, soot lofted into the atmosphere and spread across hemispheres, could dim sunlight and shorten growing seasons, imperiling crops and livelihoods on a global scale. Scientists have modeled scenarios in which even modest exchanges produce drops in global temperature and dramatic declines in food production, with cascading effects on trade, migration, and political stability. To put this in sharper human focus, consider the story of a single city and the layers of consequence it can suffer. The first wave kills or injures those in the immediate radius. Hospitals are overwhelmed. Emergency responders are killed or cut off. The second wave is the collapse of services, power grids offline, water systems compromised, roads impassable. The third wave is the slow attrition, infection, starvation, chronic illness from radiation exposure, loss of agricultural productivity, and the erosion of mental health and social cohesion. Children who survive face long-term health effects, and communities that once supported people are scattered and diminished. Yet alongside the horror, there are stories of resilience and human courage. In the darkest chapters of history, survivors have found ways to rebuild, to care for one another, and to try to reconstruct some sense of normalcy. Those stories matter because they show the dignity of people even when the systems around them fail. But reconstruction requires time, safety, and resources. And extensive contamination can make any meaningful recovery slow and partial.
We cannot talk about weapons without pausing on the scale of deterrence that keeps them in place. Deterrence rests on the idea that the certainty of retaliation prevents aggression. It is a brittle logic. If every actor behaves rationally and communications remain intact, it can avert war. But the world is not a laboratory. People are not purely rational machines. Mistakes happen. Communications fail. Accidents occur. False alarms can produce responses if the margin for error is too small. When missiles fly in minutes, the window for considered judgment narrows to seconds. That compression of decision time increases the risk that misinterpretation or technical glitch triggers an irreversible course. The modernization of arsenals also complicates the picture. Older, bulky weapons that needed large platforms have been supplemented or replaced by warheads that are more accurate and more adaptable. The ability to strike with precision can lower the threshold for use in the mind of a planner. A smaller yield might be thought to reduce collateral damage, or a prompt strike could be rationalized to prevent an adversary from using their forces. But the line between conventional and nuclear, between tactical and strategic, becomes hazier, and in that blur, miscalculation becomes likelier. Another important aspect is the persistence of radioactive contamination. Not all isotopes are the same. Some decay quickly, emitting intense radiation that fades in days or weeks. Others remain hazardous for decades. Cesium and strontium, for instance, can settle into soil and enter food chains, creating long-term risks for agriculture and human health. The cleanup of urban areas contaminated by significant fallout can take years and cost vast sums, and until remediation is complete, the land may be unsafe for habitation or cultivation. The global community has tried, at times successfully, to make these dangers less acute. Treaties and agreements have reduced some arsenals, established monitoring regimes, and opened channels of communication. Arms control has been, in essence, an effort to build shared constraints, to erect guardrails around dangerous technologies. Those guardrails have had real effects. They have lowered the total number of weapons and fostered a degree of predictability. But agreements require trust, verification, and political will, and all of those can ebb and flow with geopolitical tides. At the center of this story are people in everyday life. We can talk in technical terms about yields, delivery vehicles, and command and control architectures, but each term ultimately translates into choices about safety, about risk, about the lives of strangers and neighbors. When planners model a scenario and say limited use is possible, what they sometimes failed to reckon with is the way human systems intertwine. A hospital does not operate in isolation from the water supply. A city does not feed itself without a supply chain. A country's resilience depends on networks of electricity, of food, of medicine that extend beyond any single local point of failure. There is an ethical question tucked into the center of the technical discussion. Once a technology exists that can destroy entire cities, what responsibilities do inventors, leaders, and citizens have to prevent its use? That question is neither easy nor abstract. It requires public engagement, diplomatic imagination, scientific humility, and political courage. It asks whether states can commit credibly to constraints that reduce the risk of catastrophe, and whether mechanisms exist to enforce those commitments. Practical measures can reduce risk, lowering the alert status of weapons, increasing the time needed to launch, reduces the pressure on decision-makers and allows for deliberation. Transparency measures, such as data exchanges and notifications, can reduce misperception. Robust communication channels between adversaries can prevent the cascade of misunderstanding that otherwise might lead to escalation. Technical safeguards and improvements in command and control can reduce the danger of accidental launches. None of these measures offers perfect protection, but they can change the odds. Ultimately, the scale that matters is not the tonnage of explosive force, but the degree to which human systems are vulnerable to it. A single well-placed blast can do immense damage in a dense city. Multiple blasts across regions can produce cascading failures with global reach. The question we face is whether we will let the scale of that danger remain hidden behind technical jargon, or whether we will confront it openly and democratically. This is not merely a matter of defense policy. It is a moral conversation about how people want to live together in a world that has created its own means of self-destruction. The existence of these weapons asks us to imagine futures we hope never to see, and to decide how to make those futures less probable. It asks leaders to weigh the temporary advantages of security against the permanent costs of existential risk. It asks citizens to demand accountability and to engage with questions that are often left to narrow circles of experts. There are ways forward that do not rely on fantasy. Reduction of arsenals, verification regimes that can detect cheating, de-alerting measures that lengthen decision times and strengthen diplomatic channels can all reduce the danger. Investments in resilient infrastructure and emergency preparedness can save lives in worst-case scenarios. Scientific work that clarifies the climatic and agricultural consequences of a wide-scale exchange helps policymakers understand the stakes. None of these actions is simple or free, but each one is a concrete step away from catastrophe. If we step back from technicalities, the central fact remains stark. Modern weapons concentrate into a handful of engineered devices the capacity to unmake neighborhoods, to contaminate land, and to disrupt global systems. They translate human ingenuity into a capacity for mass destruction on a scale previously unimaginable. Confronting that reality requires more than fear. It requires a deliberate civic response that blends technical understanding with ethical resolve. The human stories that exist in the shadow of these weapons teach us something else. Resilience and compassion persist even where systems fail. Communities have rebuilt after catastrophe. People have tended to the wounded in the absence of formal institutions. Yet reconstruction requires time, safety, and the restoration of basic goods. The more extensive the contamination and destruction, the narrower the path to recovery becomes. In the end, the true scale of this challenge is not only in megatons or missiles, it is in our collective appetite for risk and our shared responsibility to reduce it. Understanding scale is the first step. Acting on that understanding is the next. If the story of these weapons teaches us anything, it is that the most powerful technologies must be matched by equally powerful institutions of restraint and oversight. We carry forward this knowledge not to paralyze, but to inform. To choose to live with this knowledge is to accept a duty, to be clear-eyed about the risks, to insist on transparency and control where possible, and to nurture the institutions that can keep catastrophe at bay. The world has walked close to these edges before, and it can choose to step back. The question is whether we will make that choice deliberately, with the moral seriousness it demands, or whether we will drift into risk by default. The choices ahead are not simple political maneuvers. They are decisions about human survival, dignity, and the stewardship of future generations. Every policy, every treaty, every technical safeguard is an act of will, a decision to protect the ordinary rhythms of life against the possibility of extraordinary violence. That is the measure of what truly matters.